I wasn't the best behaved child a parent could hope for. I was selfish, greedy, and hostile. A basic nightmare kid. I'd pitch fits when I didn't get my way and often make sure to break something that my folks treasured just to make my point. I would pound on walls, throw things across the room, and even slap or hit my mother or father when they would hopelessly attempt to calm me down. Many years later, I would learn that my dad had been abused by his father when he was a kid, so he would always try his best to keep his cool when I raged on. Even though I didn't understand the circumstances back then, I took advantage of that fact and made sure to push every single button I could to practically dare him to hit me. Many times he would just walk away and leave me screaming and raging, but I still considered that a win. Oh yeah, I was much more than a handful, but my parents still loved me even if I was a monster in the making. It wasn't until that Christmas Eve of 2001 when I learned that I was not the center of the universe after all, a lesson I most definitely needed to learn. It was during the family gathering on that day before Christmas when I pitched a legendary fit upon learning the supposed truth about the reality of Santa Claus. I was only 10 years old, and were it not for the kind hearts of my folks, I would have spent every single one of those years on the naughty list. That late December threatened to turn every one of those who still cared for me off the deep end. Everyone had arrived at our house for the festive meal, and my cousin Courtney had been pushing my buttons all day. She was a good 3 years older than me and thought she knew everything about everything. Being far more experienced and knowledgeable than I, she assured me that there was no such person as Father Christmas, something that I was not ready to hear. She kept pushing and pushing all day, and I finally just lost it. We were in my bedroom on the second floor of my childhood home. Over the course of my raging tantrum, I pushed her out of my safe space with every ounce of strength my little arms could muster. Even after I got her out of my door, I continued thrusting my hands into her back, paying no attention to what lay ahead. She had already started crying before I gave the final jab. I sent her rolling down the stairs. She tumbled against the wall and the railing as her arms flailed and her head bounced from one step to the next. There were snapping sounds and muffled yelps that ended with a thud when she hit the floor below, leaving only silence. Every adult had made it out there before her fall came to a close, and their shocked and appalled eyes cut from her twisted body to my guilty face. I had performed some awful acts during my short lifespan before that day, but my parents had always attempted to cure my terrible ways with kindness. This would mark the end of such times. Before the ambulance arrived, my father snatched me by the collar and dragged me into my bedroom. He screamed at me in a way I did not realize he was capable of. I was crying my eyes out while I begged for forgiveness, but he wouldn't let up. He wanted me to cry. And he was right. I deserved that and worse. As his anger grew more intense with every word, he raised a hand up to strike me. It wasn't until then that his own rage faltered. He just stared at his open hand for a moment before he dropped it exhaustedly back to his side. He glared back at me, and I watched the scowl on his face lighten back to a more neutral expression, with tears slowly dripping from his eyes. He just shook his head and turned to leave the room without so much as looking back at me before he slammed the door shut. I wouldn't see him again for the remainder of the day. The house fell silent after the paramedics left, with Courtney strapped to a gurney. I watched out my window to see everyone, including my parents, leave the house to follow the ambulance to the hospital. I was never left alone at home, but clearly no one could stand to be around me at that moment. Truth be told, I didn't much care to be around myself. The hours dragged by while I sat alone in my bedroom, surrounded by all the toys and video games my behavior had never earned me. Regardless of my short lifespan, having included an almost endless supply of tantrums and violent mood swings when I didn't get my way, I never really felt bad about the misery I wrought. I only cared that I got what I wanted by the time I was done. This time, however, I didn't feel any level of joy from this. I tried to defend myself in the back of my mind, reasoning that it was completely the fault of my older cousin for pushing my buttons. But I knew she didn't deserve this. Yeah, perhaps if she hadn't gotten in my face, I wouldn't have snapped like I had. But her actions did not warrant what I did to her. Maybe she just ended up with a couple of bruises, and it's not as bad as it sounded, I told myself. Though I could still hear the snapping of her bones ringing in the background of my silent, dark room. No matter how hard I worked to evade the guilt that was in pursuit, I could not escape it. I can't say I'd ever felt that way before. Even when I broke the big screen television my father took such pride in, I didn't feel bad. Regardless of inadvertently setting fire to the curtains in the living room, which very possibly could have burned down the entire house if my mother's reflexes hadn't been so quick, my conscience still felt clear. There was no getting away from this one, no matter how much inner arguing I tried. Courtney could be dead for all I knew, and her blood would be on my hands. For hours I just sat there in silence, perched upon the floor of my room. Even after the sun retreated for the night, I did not move from that same spot. I could have gotten to my feet to at least turn a light on, but I wanted to be in the dark. Any light could run the risk of me seeing my reflection in the window or something. I couldn't look into my own eyes at that moment. While my brooding continued and the world outside fell still, I became aware of a slight rumbling. It felt as though the whole house had begun to tremble slightly. The sensation was growing more and more intense by the second, finally inspiring me to break myself free from the carpeted floor for the first time in hours. I ran to my window to look outside after a light appeared to beam through, almost as if the sun had shot back up from its dormant state. I could barely believe what I saw while I pressed my nose to the glass. My childhood home was on a very average suburban street. Most of the houses sported similar designs with not much variation in color palettes. A 2-lane road with houses on either side of it, just like millions of other neighborhoods across the country. Said road had now been replaced by a train track, with a long and somewhat ancient-looking steam train parked upon it. The smoke billowed from the wide chimney on front, lining the entire street in an almost unnatural fog. As I stared on at this unusual sight, I saw a man in a red conductor uniform exiting the train. As soon as he set foot on the snowy ground, he glanced back up to meet my gaze. I quickly ducked down beneath the window, but I could still feel his eyes on me. I lifted my head to look down at the man once more to find he was still glaring at me. He had a kind face with a wide smile and bright eyes, from what I could see. He raised a hand and gestured for me to come to him. Though I was more than a little freaked out by this, something inside me was almost begging to march out into the cold to see this up close and personal. I grabbed my thickest winter coat, scarf, and boots, and ran down the stairs without looking back. I threw the front door to my house wide open, and I just stood there, staring out. I pulled the knit cap from my pocket and pulled it snugly onto my head, while the conductor still smiled on, waving his arm to beckon me forward. I stepped out into the thick snow on the ground, while swinging the door shut behind me. The wide-eyed and grinning expression of the man did not falter, while I took as wide steps as I could, crushing the snow beneath my boot. "Are you ready, lad?" the man asked in a strange sort of tone, but a very proper-sounding English accent. Ready for what?" I asked, craning my neck to look into the man's eyes. He was much taller up close than I had expected when I watched him from my second-floor window. He appeared to be straining a little while bending his head down to look back at me. "To go to the North Pole, of course," he replied. "You're not serious," I scoffed. Do you doubt your own eyes, child? He asked, holding his arms out as if to present the train to me, like I hadn't noticed it. The man's expression had still not wavered, even a little. His bright green eyes were so wide that they almost appeared to not be cupped on top and bottom with any eyelids, just perfectly round circles with small pupils in the center. His perfectly aligned, sparkling white teeth looked almost false and slightly cartoony. Though the face as a whole seemed unthreatening, I became more and more uncomfortable the longer I stared at it. No, I replied, shaking my head. I don't think I should. He just glared down at me with those cue balls for eyes and chiclet teeth, neither blinking nor moving in the slightest. I felt my back tense up, and I was unsure if it was due to the frigid cold or the gaze of the stranger in the dark red train conductor's uniform. I started to back away from the man, whose brow had begun to sink a little, forming a crease above the large and now darkening eyes. They had been a light green before, but as I stepped away from him, they appeared to have grown a much deeper shade, bordering on black. I think I'm gonna go back inside now, I said as I continued to back away. We continued our staring contest as I waved my hands around behind my back, hoping to feel my front door approaching soon. The second I felt my fingertips make contact with it, the conductor outstretched his own arm in front of him, still maintaining his unsettling gaze. As I turned the knob, the white-gloved hand shot toward me, growing as it drew closer until the elongated fingers wrapped themselves around my entire torso. The grip was so tight it almost squeezed the breath right out of my lungs before it rapidly yanked me back to the man. Before I knew it, he was holding me right in front of his face. His unblinking eyes appeared almost the size of my head while he examined my face. You will be boarding this train, young man. His foul breath hit me like a truck, causing me to cough and gag from the stench. Would you care to climb the steps of your own volition? Or shall I carry you like this? His eyes looked as though they were pulsing while they glared into mine. The horrendous odor that spilled from his mouth still lingered in my nostrils, but it wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as his stare. I'll walk, I stuttered in little more than a whisper. The man nodded his head as he gently placed me back onto the ground. My shaky legs threatened to drop me to the concrete, and I briefly considered attempting to flee again. Somehow I knew that there would be little point in that. I would be boarding this train whether I liked it or not. The choice was no longer in my hands, if it had ever been in the first place. The lanky conductor lowered his body into a bow while he gestured toward the door that stood just above the 4 metal steps. My whole body was trembling while I approached and climbed up into the cab. There was an aged and musty smell that spilled from the inside as I crossed through the precipice, with the tall, slender man pulling himself up behind me. Take any open seat you like, he said as we paced through into the passenger car. I glanced across the carriage to see only a handful of other children perched upon the seats of the elegant yet somewhat eerie room. They all turned to look at me when I entered, and they all wore the same exhausted and timidly fearful expressions. There was a short-haired blonde kid with large, round glasses, wearing striped pajamas and a dark green robe. He looked to be around 12 or so, if I had to guess. An African-American girl with long, braided pigtails, who looked to be about the same age as I, dressed in a unicorn nightgown and a thick white coat with a fur-lined collar. A little red-haired girl in a puffy pink coat sat next to a ginger boy who looked maybe a year or two older than her. I assumed they were siblings. He wore a long, hooded blue coat and appeared to be bordering on tears while he glared back at me. The cabin itself was quite large, far bigger on the inside than I would have thought when I looked on from my bedroom window. The ceiling was maybe 15 feet high, with 3 golden and ornate chandeliers hanging from it. They each had several flickering candles, though they provided little light to the dimly lit cabin. Shimmering yet slightly tattered tinsel drooped from them in no particular pattern or design. Each red velvet-lined row of seats had a large, arched window to the side, with delicate filigree borders. The carpeted floor was the same color as the chairs, but it was lined in yellows and greens, all speckled in a variety of muddy stains. Still, as classy as the place looked, there was something about it that felt ancient and ghostly. This seemed a place in which the dead would gather to travel from one plane to the next, not one that would carry small and terrified children to the wonders of Santa's workshop. As my trembling legs led me to the closest seat, I had little doubt that we were not bound for any place fantastical and inspiring. Given the fact that I had very possibly killed my older cousin, this journey was not to reward me. The sour expressions etched onto the faces of my traveling companions led me to believe that we were all on the same page. We would be facing punishment for our ill deeds this night, something I could not deny that I deserved. We all sat in silence while the tall, thin man made his way back to the front of the cabin, before sliding the door open and leaving our sight. Occasionally, one kid would glance at another before cutting their eyes back to the world that was now swiftly moving beside us. The train made little noise as it traversed the tracks that seemed invisible to the occasional bystander or driver behind the wheel of one car or another. It felt like we would just pass through any obstacle that may drift in front of the speeding rail car, as though we existed now in a separate plane of existence. I briefly considered the notion that I had died and was now being transported to whatever realm awaited me in the afterlife, but it was more of a fleeting thought, mixed with a grain of denial. As I stared out the window to see the row of houses give way to a snowy and empty expanse, I became aware of the sweat that had begun to drip from my brow. I realized that it was almost suffocatingly hot in here, and I thought it may be best to remove my thick winter coat. As I leaned forward to slide the padded fabric down my shoulders, the cute little pigtailed girl across from me cleared her throat to catch my attention. She shook her head violently, whispering, "Don't." "Why not?" I asked. "It's so hot in here." "Shh," one of the gingers echoed from up front. "What the hell?" I asked, darting my eyes between the other occupants of the railcar. "Shh," came from all directions now, and the girl across from me still shook her head wildly as I continued to pull off my coat. "You guys are being dumb," I said, shaking my own head, pulling my left arm free from my jacket. Suddenly, the door at the front slid to the side, revealing the still smiling face of the conductor behind it. Instantly, all of the other children turned their gaze away from me to look down at their own laps or out their windows. I sat in place with my right arm still in my coat, staring at the tall man as he strolled in wide strides toward me. He stopped when he got next to the seat I sat in, before turning to face me with his head tilted to one side. We just stared at each other for a moment, before he said, "Here, we only have one rule." I felt my heart begin to race, while the wide, round eyes darkened once more. "Never, ever, let them cool." I slowly pulled my coat back up my left arm and pulled it shut in front of me. As I continued another staring contest with the grinning man, he held his right hand up beside his face, snapping his fingers. Seconds later, another man came speeding through the door, pushing a cart which held a tall pitcher and a single filthy mug. It took me a second to notice that the one who pushed the tray appeared to have absolutely no features upon his face. It was like a blank sheet of flesh with two small holes for eyes. No mouth, no nose or ears. The stained green and white striped shirt he wore hung to his knees with eerily thin, pale legs protruding from beneath. I only refer to him as, well, him, because their proportions and mannerisms were somewhat masculine. Otherwise, there was little way of telling what he actually was. The blank-faced man stopped with the car right beside the conductor, who reached for the pitcher with his eyes still fixed on me. He poured dark and steaming liquid into the cup without spilling a single drop, despite his gaze not shifting from mine. He laid the pitcher down and snatched up the cup, holding it out toward me. I reached up with my trembling hand and grabbed the mug, expecting it to burn my fingers, but it surprisingly didn't even feel warm. "Drink." I raised the cup up to my mouth and instantly recoiled when the steam billowing from the fluid felt as though it would burn my upper lip. "It's too hot," I whined, lowering the cup back down. "One rule." But I tensed up from head to toe while tears began to stream down my face. There was no way I could pour this scalding drink into my mouth. I knew it would burn me from the inside out. The slender arms reached out to me again, one wrapping its thin fingers around the hand which held the mug, and the other clutching onto the top of my head. He forced the cup up to my mouth while pulling my head backward. "Never." The rim hit my lower lip, immediately and excruciatingly fusing the tender skin with the ceramic. "Ever." The thumb of the hand which gripped my head tightly extended and lowered to push my bottom jaw open. "Let them." I was struggling to break free from his grasp, and though he only held me by the head and hand, I couldn't even move my body. "Cool." He tipped the bubbling beverage into my open mouth, spilling the burning liquid across the skin of my face as much as down my throat. I screamed out, horrified by the immense pain I had never before imagined. I felt blisters form on the outside of my mouth as well as inside of my gaping orifice. It was like fire was erupting from within me, as though it were melting my insides, tearing holes in the inner lining of my esophagus and stomach. My flesh bubbled and popped, while my guts churned against the unbearable suffering. As the final drops fell from the cup into my gullet, I felt the dark fluid begin to leak from holes it had formed in my neck and torso. I was only vaguely aware of the hand as it let go of my head and hand, while I coughed up thick blood onto my coat. As the conductor gingerly placed the mug back onto the rolling trolley, after tearing it away from the lip which had bonded to it, he ushered the blank-faced man out of the room. My body was spasming and twitching while the holes in my flesh sealed themselves back shut. The bubbling skin on my face became still and soft once more, and the horrendous agony subsided. I turned to face the tall man again, to see him studying me, tilting his head from one side to the other like a curious dog. I just stared back at him, still trembling from the shock of the events which had just happened. He just turned on the spot before walking back to the front of the cabin and out the door, sliding it shut behind him. Though my wounds had all closed and my flesh showed no signs of the torment it had just suffered, my clothes were still damp from the liquid which had poured inside and through me. I had never felt more pain than the occasional scraped knee or elbow before that day. Perhaps some bruises from a fall from my clumsy twin left feet from time to time, but nothing even close to what I had just been through. I was still shaking all over, and none of the other kids would even acknowledge me. They had tried to warn me, I couldn't deny that. Had they already experienced this themselves? I wondered. How long had the others been on board this train before I arrived? Would any of us ever escape this wretched thing? My head was in chaos as I turned to face the window again, to watch the world beyond these walls travel rapidly as we thundered forward. There had to be a way out, even if it meant leaping from the train and onto the snowy ground outside. Maybe it would be thick enough to break my fall. I'm sure I wouldn't make it unscathed. But what in the hell awaited us if we reached our destination? I had to communicate with my cellmates. I can't say that I was in a rush to break any more rules, but according to the conductor, I only had the one. Snow-covered fields were all that surrounded the speeding train as I gazed through the glass, which was heavily frosted on the outside. My body was still trembling, though it was still insufferably hot in the train car I shared with the other silent children. Every now and then I could swear I saw movement within the white mounds of earth outside. Though it was dark outside, the full moon shone down through a cloudless sky, which may have been just causing me to see things as we sped by the landscape. Regardless of how peaceful, yet strangely unsettling my surroundings appeared, I was terrified of what awaited us when the train reached its destination. With the torment I had already endured, surely what was still to come would be far worse. I felt my eyes welling up again as the hopelessness of it all struck me like a hammer to the jaw. I bowed my head, whispering prayers under my breath to make it through this in one place. I had been an awful and conniving little brat my whole life, all 10 years of it. Perhaps I had no right to ask for forgiveness with the awful things I had done only hours before I found myself on this journey to hell. "Hey!" I heard a whispered voice call from my left. I turned to see the little girl across the aisle smiling at me. "Hi," I replied softly. I meant to speak a little louder, but it seemed I was no longer capable of anything more than a whisper. Maybe I had sustained some lasting damage after all. She smiled at me with something remorseful in her eyes. It was as though she felt guilty for what I had just endured. But even as much of a shitty human being as I was, I knew she tried to help me. I was just too damn pig-headed to see it. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." She cut her stare away as she spoke with a slight crack in her voice. "It's not your fault," I said, attempting to smile as much as I could. We just stared at each other for a moment. She was a pretty girl with beautiful big brown eyes. She looked very tired, though. I couldn't tell if it was exhaustion from this experience, or just the fact that it was sometime after midnight by this point. I was still quite young, and hadn't really taken the time to appreciate the opposite sex just yet, but I found myself quite taken with her. That caused my face to flush, and cut my eyes away from her in embarrassment. "I'm Sophie," she whispered. I couldn't tell if she was keeping her voice low in hopes of avoiding alerting our host, or if she may have been forced to ingest the acid-like concoction herself. Mikey," I replied, still feeling incredibly shy. "Will you shut the hell up?" the boy in the round glasses called out in an aggravated whisper. "You're gonna get us all in trouble if you don't stop." His neck was craned around the edge of his seat to look at me, and his brow formed a scowl, not unlike the one my father had shown me earlier that day. I was a little annoyed that he was seemingly only directing his rage at me when I was not alone in the conversation I was having, but I could still understand where he was coming from. God knows what the other members of this small group had gone through before I boarded. I just nodded at the angry kid before giving Sophie a guilty smile and a shrug. The boy turned back to face away from me again, while I still gazed at the little girl on the seat beside me. We locked eyes for a few moments, and I was surprised the experience didn't make me feel more uncomfortable. There was something peaceful about her, which helped my scattered mind regain a little more composure. It was, however, until the door slid open again. "Tickets, please," the conductor said as he strolled up to the red-haired kids up front. I don't have a ticket, sir," the boy replied, stammering to get his words out. "I beg to differ, young man," the tall man said as he snatched up the right hand of the child. The boy yelped when the man whipped a large ticket puncher out of his pocket. In one quick motion, he slid the kid's hand into the device and punched a hole right through the center of his palm. He cried out in pain as blood spurted from the wound onto his shirt and tears spilled down his face. The little girl beside him tried to struggle against the slender man in the dark red suit when he wrapped his long fingers around her wrist, but he was far stronger than she was. As much as she fought to pull her hand away from him, he still managed to poke a fresh hole into her flesh, just as he had her brother. I tensed up and began hyperventilating as I watched the blood trickle onto the carpet while the conductor made his way to the kid with the round glasses, leaving the two still sobbing behind him. Another scream echoed through the cabin after the third ticket was punched, and I found myself shaking violently as the man paced back toward me. "Ticket, please." Still reeling from the burning liquid being forced down my gullet, I knew it would be a terrible idea to refuse the man's demands, so I offered my trembling hand, while biting down and preparing for what was to come. If nothing else, it was quick. Truth be told, the pain wasn't nearly as bad as I had expected. I still screamed, of course, but it wasn't from the pain as much as the sound of the metal prong chewing through my tissue. I can't say I'd ever seen that much blood pour out of me before. Sure, the holes which had only recently formed in my throat and gut mixed scarlet streams with the brown liquid as it oozed out from within me. But this was just thick, dark crimson that leaked from me now. It didn't stop flowing as quickly as my previous injuries either. The conductor still glared at me while I cupped my gushing right hand in my left. He almost appeared disappointed that I wasn't making as much of a fuss as the other kids, who still whined and sobbed. I turned my gaze to meet the little girl across the aisle, trying to mentally signify to her that it wasn't all that bad. Strangely, she showed no signs of fear or apprehension. She just smiled back at me with something in her eyes I couldn't quite figure out. "What are you looking at, child?" the grinning man asked before I cut my eyes back to meet his. "Huh?" I replied, quite confused by the question, as I found it quite obvious who I was looking at. "What are you looking at?" There was an impatience to his voice, regardless of the fact that he spoke almost mockingly slowly. "What?" Before I could finish my single-word reply, he swatted the back of his hand against the side of my face. This hurt considerably more than the hole in my hand. I could not tell if my spinning head was due to the impact or the blood loss, as my palm still oozed onto my pants. "The girl!" I replied, with tears streaming down my swelling face. For the first time, I watched the wide smile falter. The conductor's expression appeared to melt into an almost human form before he turned slowly to face the girl sitting across from me. He stood staring at her for what felt like minutes before he quickly turned on the spot and sped back through the door at the front of the cabin. When the door slammed shut, I looked back over at the cute little girl, who quickly cut her eyes away from me. "What just happened?" I asked, truly mind-boggled over the fact that the man appeared to not even know she was there. "That's, complicated," she replied with a shrug. "How come?" Nothing had made any sort of sense since this whole nightmare began, but this was something I could not even begin to wrap my head around. "Well," she said, still refusing to allow our eyes to meet. "The thing is..." She was cut off by the door sliding open with the conductor practically sprinting through it toward us. I pressed my back against the window, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen, while the little girl jumped out of her seat and into the aisle. She just glared at the man with her hands balled into fists as he charged at her. His movements were fast, so much faster than my eyes could even register. In an instant, he tackled the girl, rolled onto the floor, and back up to his feet with his arms wrapped around her. She was struggling against him, but he held her far too tightly as he headed out the door behind where I sat, slamming it closed behind him. We all stared at the sealed door with our collective mouths hanging slack and wide. The kids at the front of the car were murmuring back and forth, clearly attempting to puzzle together what had just happened. Before I was even aware of what I was doing, I took off toward the back door. As I pulled it open and headed through, I heard the other kids yelling at me to come back, but I felt suddenly filled with more purpose than I'd ever known myself to be capable. I charged through the door to the next train car, then the following one, still finding no trace of the two who had passed through. All three cars that were behind the one I fled from showed no evidence that they had ever been occupied. While I stared off the back of the train, taking in the vast, empty landscape in our wake, I knew what I had to do. Clearly, they had not fled backward, leaving only one logical direction. As he had not carried her back through the doorway he entered, I had to deduce that they had gone up to the roof of the train. I sprinted back through the cars until I reached the doorway to the one I had left. Though my hands still violently trembled, I reached for the ladder, which led up to the roof with my still bleeding hand. I had no idea what I would do if I caught up to the conductor, but I had to at least attempt to save the little girl from whatever he had planned for her. I had never put anyone's needs before my own my entire life. Perhaps it was the guilt I still felt over what I had done to my cousin that drove me to attempt a likely ill-fated rescue. I knew I would likely not survive this, but there was something about that girl. I had to save her, no matter the cost. The strong wind was freezing when I reached the snow-covered roof, which honestly felt quite remarkable at first, given the stifling heat inside. Still, it didn't take long for the cold to feel as though it was biting right through me. The chill aggravated my still-leaking hand, though the blood flow had slowed considerably. As I paced on, I found it difficult to even hold myself upright, let alone push my body onward. But I knew I had to. The first several steps required far more effort than I had hoped, leaving me unsure if I would even be capable of completing my self-appointed mission. Perhaps it was the guilt I still felt over what I had done to my cousin that inspired me to continue to force one foot in front of the other. But I dreaded to think what the cute little pigtailed girl was enduring while I trudged through the thick snow. Once I got into a rhythm, I managed to quicken my pace, but only slightly. Pushing against the strong and icy wind, combined with the high strides I was having to take to break each step free from the snow, made swift progress out of the question. But it was progress. I could barely see 4 feet in front of me, let alone whatever distance I would have to traverse before reaching a battle I was sure to lose. But I wouldn't let that stop me. I plundered on with purpose, and with every single successful step I took, I was more driven by that. I had no way of telling how much time had passed as I leapt from train car to train car. The first jump was the hardest and the most terrifying, but not unlike those initial hesitant footfalls, every leap was less scary than the last. By the time I saw a faint light ahead of me, I had successfully cleared 6 boxcars. As I drew closer to the light, I could see that it flickered like fire, that appeared to float several feet off the roof.
"You should not be here, little boy."
A voice even more unsettling than that of the conductor spoke. I felt my bladder attempt to give way as the shimmering light moved closer to me, revealing what appeared to be an incredibly tall person with an ancient-looking fire lantern for a head. It wore a long, brown, snow-speckled coat, which came down to feet that were buried in the snow. Its long arms hung past where I presumed its knees to be, as it stared down at me as well. As much as a lamp can stare, I suppose. Still, I could feel it glaring at me, causing that same discomfort the conductor's wide gaze had caused. I have to get by," I said, doing my best impersonation of someone with actual confidence in his words. Without another word, its long arm reached toward me. I ducked down and rolled through the snow, managing to avoid its grasp. But this did not get me any closer to my goal. It swiped at me with the right arm, following with another swing from its left. Fortunately, the thing did not move quickly, and I found myself able to dodge. It just continued to swat at me while I tumbled and lapped around its elongated limbs, while attempting to locate any way of getting past. Finally, I noticed a split in the long coat, where the buttons ended just above the presumed knees. As both arms reached out for me again, I jumped forward and into the open section of the trench coat. The legs I now crouched between looked thin and frail, so before the bony hands which were attempting to reach me through the opening could grab me, I kicked the left foot, which stood in the thick snow to my right. Even with my small and weak stature, it didn't take much to cause the tall creature to stumble. As the leg I kicked slid to the side of the roof of the train, the other came crashing down on me. Before it could pummel me to the ground, I rolled out through the curtain-like back of the long coat. Once I was clear, I turned around to see arms and legs flailing as the lamp-headed thing stumbled off the speeding train. I saw nothing more than a quick flash of light, followed by a thin line of smoke rising from where I assume it had made contact with the ground. With my heart still hammering, I stood up on my trembling legs and stared back onto the path in hopes of tracking my quarry before whatever the conductor had planned for the little girl occurred. Though I feared I would run into another of whatever that thing with the flickering head was, I didn't run into any more obstacles until I reached the front of the train. The carriages ended with only a long trolley filled with coal and the engine just ahead of it. Just as I started to gather up enough courage to leap into the rough and jagged coal, I found myself nearly paralyzed with fear when a familiar voice spoke from behind me.
And where do you think you're going?
The conductor spoke directly into my ear. I spun in place to see his wide eyes and grinning face only inches from mine. He just stood there, leaning over at the waist to gaze directly at me. I could barely form anything close to actual words while we stared at one another.
Well, speak up, boy.
His darkened eyes formed that unsettling scowl again. The girl, I asked in little more than a stuttered whisper.
Ejected, I'm afraid. Would you like to join her?
We just stared at each other again. I was terrified that I was about to be launched from this very spot, only to crash down to the ground around us. I couldn't help but wonder if this would be a better option to whatever the hell he had in store for me, if I were permitted to remain on board.
I didn't think so,
he said, wrapping his fingers around my face and lifting me from the snowy roof. I braced myself in preparation for being tossed like a rag doll, but he didn't throw me over the side. He just stomped in wide strides, with me hanging by my head and his outstretched arm. He moved quickly, crossing the carriages much faster than my tiny legs had. I wouldn't say I was particularly comfortable, dangling like a flashy Christmas ornament by the face. I was beginning to feel secure that my punishment may not be overly severe this time. Naturally, I got too far of myself again.
He
said, stopping in place. He glanced back into my eyes, one of which was covered by his large palm.
It's quite cool out here, isn't it?
With those words, my heart began to race once again.
One rule.
The words echoed from the back of my mind. I hadn't broken the law of the train by climbing out of my seat. Not when I crossed through the other cars, nor when I tipped my attacker off the side. Stepping out into the cold night air in the first place, though, that's where I crossed the line. The smile on the conductor's face practically extended to his ears as the malice formed on his brow once more. He tilted his head to the side, studying what he could see of my face through his fingers. He reached his other hand up and snapped his fingers again, causing the hand which held me to burst into flames. The pain was immediate and unbearable. I screamed out as my skin bubbled and popped and dripped onto my shoulder, while fluids leaked down the conductor's arm. I could feel my flesh peeling away in thin sheets, while my eyeballs popped and oozed from their sockets. As the tall man paced on, I lost all track of the passage of time, existing only in the insufferable agony of my melting head. Somewhere along the line, I must have blacked out. It wasn't until my body was tossed onto the hard floor of the cabin, behind the one which still held the other terrified children, that I came back to awareness once more. As soon as my regrown eyes opened, I grabbed at my face to find that everything felt intact again, though I remembered every single excruciating second before I passed out.
Should I strap you down? Or will you behave?
He asked, glaring down at me with his hands behind his back. I just nodded, unable to make my voice work, hoping that he would understand which part of his question I was agreeing to. I grabbed onto the armrest of the chair closest to me and heaved myself up from the floor. I planted down into the seat, to which the conductor returned a nod. He then spun in place, stepped through the door before gently sliding it shut. As soon as he was out of sight, I fell into wailing sobs before curling up in the fetal position on the chair. Hours seemed to trickle by as I lay across the seats, trying my hardest to fall asleep and escape this nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, it was as though I saw myself from the outside, watching my face melt away. I also couldn't evade the guilt I was feeling from being unable to save the little girl who was apparently thrown from the train. I couldn't figure out why the conductor got so angry at her, nor why he appeared unaware of her even being there in the first place. Of course, nothing made any sense since I boarded this hell on wheels. After giving up on my attempts to sleep, I sat back upright in my seat to look out the window at the world beyond the glass. I no longer saw the same snowy landscape, but an unnerving lack of anything. It wasn't like the night sky had just grown so dark, hiding the world behind its blanket. It was just nothingness. Though the train still felt as though it were speeding across metal tracks, I saw no evidence of any road through the seemingly endless void. It was almost hypnotizing to look upon, though my mind could not make any rational sense of it. The longer I gazed through the glass, the more the emptiness mesmerized me.
Did he hurt you?
The voice practically caused me to leap from my skin as I sat, zoned out in front of the window. I slowly turned my body around to see Sophie, once more perched on the seat across from me.
Is it really you?
I asked, pressing my back against the glass, fearing this was just some sort of trick being played on me.
Thank you,
she said, cutting her eyes down to the floor.
For trying to rescue me. He said he ejected you.
I still wasn't ready to believe this wasn't some sort of cruel trick.
He tried. I thought I was done for, but I managed to grab onto the railing before I hit the ground.
She still wouldn't meet my eyes, which only made me less willing to believe what she was saying. I just continued to stare at her. I couldn't even begin to fathom the odds of her claims being possible, even though I was just a child. Santa Claus? Yes, of course he was real, regardless of what my cousin thought. Scooby-Doo? Obviously based on true events. Yeah, I'm sure he couldn't really talk, but they have to exaggerate things for TV. A young girl being tossed from a speeding train in the middle of an icy cold expanse, luckily wrapping her fingers around a metal railing, saving herself from certain doom? Yeah, unlikely at best.
I swear I'm telling the truth,
she pleaded, finally locking eyes with me, while sliding off of her seat to cross the aisle toward me. I still pushed my body against the glass, terrified of the possibilities of what actually stood before me, dressed up as a little girl. That was until she sat beside me and placed her warm hand on the side of my face. There was something about her touch that caused my heart to regulate for the first time since stepping into this godforsaken train. I hadn't even realized I was trembling this whole time, until my skin stopped shivering. My back relaxed. My body almost drooped exhaustively from the weight of all of the pain and anguish I had suffered, fading away into the background. Before I knew it, I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close to me. I laid my head on her shoulder and cried harder than I had in years, even more than after the conductor left me alone in this carriage. I wailed from the lingering guilt of the actions that led me here, along with so many others that had only now become clear. Yes, I was just a little kid. It's easy to claim that I didn't know any better. But I did. Somewhere in the deepest pits of my mind, I knew what a spoiled and selfish little bastard I was. And for the first time ever, I wanted to change. I saw flashes of the exhausted looks of my parents when I would lose it in public or around others. I heard the sounds of my mother sobbing when I had pushed her way too far so many times. At that very moment, as I spilled a seemingly endless river of tears onto Sophie's coat, I swore I would make things right if I was ever able to return to my home again. Truth be told, I could have sat there for hours, content in the arms of someone I had never laid eyes on before that day. But like every other fleeting fancy on this voyage of the damned, it was to be short-lived. I didn't even hear the door slide back open before the bellowing voice of the no longer smiling conductor raged from the front of the cab.
How did you get back here?
In an instant, Sophie pulled away from me and leapt from the seat to stand in the center of the aisle, glaring up at the tall man in the dark red suit, just as she had before. She didn't even appear frightened, while they waged a staring battle that sent shivers up the length of my spine, while forming goosebumps across my skin.
You have overstepped your bounds, Abigor,
the little girl said in a voice strong and proud.
This train is mine, Zophiel. You have no jurisdiction here.
His voice sounded sinister as it moaned the words, filled with sheer hatred. As the conductor slowly paced toward her, a long and jagged blade manifested in his hand, which reflected the dim lights of the cabin across the walls. while the pigtailed little girl stood her ground as David facing the hulking Goliath, I found myself filled with a purpose I'd never felt before. Though it was similar to what struck me when he first pulled her from her seat in the other carriage. That urge, no, that need to protect her, this was far more intense. This child was something special. She was sacred. I had never performed a selfless act my entire life. All 10 years of it. It was time for me to make my stand. My own fear practically melted away the instant I saw the man reach his sword high above his head to strike her down, while she bowed her head, seemingly accepting her fate. As the scene played out before me in almost slow motion, I jumped from my seat, pushing Sophie away from the approaching man. "Run," I said, offering a sincere smile to the girl who now stared at me with tears welling in her eyes. I stood in place, blocking her from the sword which sliced down through the air to split me in two. I closed my eyes, feeling content in the knowledge that her face would be the last thing I would ever see. An awful, self-consumed brat dies so that a brave and wonderful little girl can live. Yeah, that's a fair trade. I felt proud of my actions, a feeling I had never before known. If you could make one wish, what would it be? I couldn't make out where the voice was coming from. I couldn't figure out where I was, for that matter. I had no body, not one that I could see or feel anyway. I could see, but everything was shielded by an intense, bright light. I think it was my street, though it was hard to tell. Was it my street? Who exactly am I? It was as though everything was hidden in plain sight behind a translucent curtain of sorts. So, what would you wish for? Anything at all? I asked through non-existent lips. Within reason, of course. I knew that voice. I'd heard it only recently. She was familiar to me. But how? Where was I before I was here? It has to be something personal. Something unique to you and to your life. What do you mean? I was growing a vague awareness of who I was, but what was it that I desired? Some ask for riches, others for fame. That could be nice. Is that what I really wanted, though? There are those who wish for beauty. You could grow to be the most handsome of men. Attractive people do tend to have more doors open to them than others. Maybe I could have it all. Money, fame, looks. No, that's not what I ached for. I had a wish not too long ago. You could have a life that so many would envy. I could, couldn't I? No, that's not what I wanted. Not like this, anyway. Can I go back? The question presented itself before I even understood what I was asking for. Back? I did something, didn't I? Something bad. What was it? I want to change something that happened yesterday. Was it yesterday? It wasn't long ago, was it? And when is now, for that matter? Is that what you would truly wish for? You could have it all, you know? No, I made a mistake. I want to take it back. Can I wish for that? Please, let me change this one thing. Let me set things right. I think I remember now. It was bad. I was bad. One more chance. That's all I want. Perhaps you can. You know Santa's not real, right? You're 10 years old now. You're way too old for that baby shit. She was poking me in the chest, giggling after every sentence.
I hated it when she acted like this. So what if I still wanted to believe? What's it to her anyway? The more she pushed and prodded, the more I could feel my face flush. If she was going to act this way, she shouldn't even be in my bedroom. "Stop it!" I screamed, pushing her back with every ounce of my strength after she jabbed me in the chest again. Her eyes widened and her lower lip quivered as she looked into my infuriated red face. Just as I readied myself to push her again, something struck me. Deja vu? No, I remember this. There's something else. That scar in the center of my hand. Suddenly a veil lifted before my eyes. Memories spilled back into my mind as though they poured from a jug. My scowl softened. My face cooled. I looked up into the eyes of my older cousin and suddenly felt a stab of guilt. "What the hell?" Courtney cried out as I wrapped my arms around her. "I'm so sorry," I said while my eyes welled up. "You're so damn weird," she said, pushing me away before running down the stairs. I stood alone in my bedroom, watching her swiftly move out of my sight, descending the stairs the proper way, as she should have been permitted to do the first time. I turned my gaze back to the interior of my room, glancing at all of my wonderful belongings. More toys and games than the average kid could hope for, lazily scattered around my spacious bedroom. Items purchased with love, which I showed as little respect for as those who bought them for me. I practically sprinted down the steps toward the dining room, to where my parents stood, surrounded by family and friends. I could tell my father tensed up as soon as I entered the room. No doubt he was prepared for yet another day of my whining, bitching, and moaning. The look on his face was almost comical when I ran forward to hug him. He and my mother shared a shocked stare while I extended my arms around her too. You okay, kiddo?" he reluctantly asked while placing his hand on the top of my head. I just looked up at my folks with tears still trickling down my face. "I'm so sorry for everything. I promise I'm gonna try to be better. I love you both so much." They stared down at me and back at each other, completely lost for words. Things changed dramatically in the weeks that followed that Christmas Eve I lived through twice. It took a while for my family to accept that I had actually changed my ways, but before long, I was closer to my mom and dad than I had ever been before. Even Courtney became almost like a sister to me. Now she was a few years older than I. She only lived a few blocks away. She would babysit me for free when my folks would enjoy the occasional night out, another thing they were hard-pressed to achieve when I was still a screeching, fit-pitching little brat, as nobody would have any desire to take care of me in their absence. The full memories of my experience on the train took some time to reform in the back of my mind, but the lessons I learned have stayed with me to this day. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the other children I shared that train car with. Maybe they had their own trials to endure before they would be set free. I can only hope that they succeeded as I did. Occasionally, I allow myself to wonder if the entire experience had been only in my head, but that small, circular scar that still remains on the palm and back of my hand would suggest that that was not the case. Some years back, I married and fathered a child, a boy who is almost as prone to tantrums as I was at his age. My wife and I are trying everything we can, though little seems to have any effect. Maybe this is just my karma for being such an insufferable little shit before I found a better way to live. Though my experience almost 20 years ago still causes me to jerk awake from a graphic and horrific nightmare from time to time, I'm grateful for that hellish trip. My son is 10 years old now, the same age I was when my outlook changed for the better. I can't deny that there's a little voice in the back of my head that secretly hopes the train arrives for him this Christmas Eve. Does that make me a bad parent?
3 years ago, I made a wish. A Christmas wish of all things, as ridiculous as that sounds. A wish that changed everything. I lost my son, my wife, my career, my future. And over those years, I tried everything I could to undo that plea I made to whichever gods allow that damned train to continue ripping lives apart. When I was a child, I put my parents, fellow kids and teachers at school, and everyone else I knew through absolute hell. I was selfish, arrogant, just all around shitty brat. That wasn't until the night I almost killed my own cousin. It was on that late December night when the mysterious train arrived outside my childhood home. A train which I not only boarded, but it showed me the truth about what I had allowed myself to become. Yes, I bled on that godforsaken train. I burned from the inside and outside. I was tortured, tormented, and if my memory serves me well, I also died. But in that final act of my old life, I saved that of another, a most gentle, kind, and loving soul who finally showed me what it meant to put someone else before myself. As brutal as that experience was, it was that very event that inspired me to become something better and to carry those lessons through my adolescence and adulthood. Regardless of the nightmares that still break me from my slumber on a fairly regular basis, I remain grateful for that haunting experience. But it was that very gratitude that inspired the wish that changed everything. My son, Caleb, though the true light of mine and my wife's life when he came into this world, began to show strikingly similar traits to my younger self as he grew. He was cruel, cold, calculating, and manipulative. An incredibly brilliant child, yes, but perhaps all the more arrogant and self-centered as I was at his age. Cindy, my wife, and I were at our wits' end, having tried counseling, both tough love and kind love, and even spankings and more timeouts than we could even count. Nothing worked. No matter what we did, he would only act worse with every effort. As we neared the holiday season back in 2022, as Caleb pushed every single button he could in his efforts to inspire us to practically break the bank to fulfill his every desire, that's when the idea, which had crossed my mind more than a time or two over the years, fully began to take root. For my son to experience his own Christmas ride on what I came to call the Bipolar Express. From the last week of November and throughout each that followed, I would mentally recite the same plea to the universe every night. Please send the train to my house this Christmas Eve. Please teach my son the error of his selfish ways. When Cindy and I awoke on that Christmas morning, bracing ourselves for the potential tantrum inspired by our son not receiving everything on his list, the silence of the house was almost deafening. On each morning of December 25th, since he had been old enough to understand, Caleb would already be tearing into his gifts by the time we would arrive in the living room. But not this one. We checked his bedroom to find the blanket peeled back upon his bed, and no trace of any warmth still present on his mattress. After inspecting every room in the house, only finding the front door cracked ajar, we spent hours driving through the neighborhood in search of him. We called neighbors and parents of his fellow students. Though he had no friends to speak of, we had no idea what else to do. By the time we called the police, not only had our desperation reached its breaking point, but I feared that my weeks of wishing may have indeed paid off. Had this been the case, though, it would seem that his experience on the train had been far less effective than mine. The investigation would be ongoing for the following months. Cindy and I were questioned, of course, but even with the guilt of being fairly certain that I was indeed responsible for him going missing, there was no evidence to prosecute wishes in the dark. Unfortunately, there was enough to know that I was hiding something. I couldn't bring myself to confess what I had done to my wife, but she knew me well enough to know that I wasn't being completely honest. The day before she walked out on me, only 3 months after our son disappeared in the night, I told her everything. not only about my wish, but what I had experienced as a child. Yeah, that didn't go so well. Looking back, there was no way I could have painted a believable picture to anyone of a rational mind. But given the mental anguish of losing our child and the stress of the investigation, I was anything but rational as I made my teary-eyed confession. I like to think that she knew that I would never consciously do anything to hurt our kid, but I can't even imagine what she may have been thinking when I told her everything. All I know is that she had never looked at me like that before. She was hurting, angry, and exhausted, and in her mind, I was making a joke of her son's disappearance. My life fell apart after the months that followed. I started drinking, just not to feel for a time. I lost everything and everyone, and I deserved to. Sometime after scraping myself from the concrete of rock bottom, I became obsessed with finding a way to undo my mistakes, of tracking down that goddamn train and demanding that it return my child. It took some time, a lot of research, mostly leading absolutely nowhere, but I eventually tracked down others who had also experienced a ride on the train, more who had survived their night of torture and torment, and came back a better version of themselves. Of course, even though finding these kindred spirits finally convinced me that I had not just imagined the whole thing, it didn't exactly get me any closer to tracking down that monstrosity. But it was enough to know that it did, that it does exist. And that was no small thing. By December of 2023, we had formed an online group of people who had survived the Bipolar Express. There were around 40 of us, spanning one side of the globe to the other, but only a handful who would actually speak up or start conversations. Of course, even though we all had common ground in some aspects, I seemed to be the only member who had inadvertently damned their own child to a fate even worse than ours. After I made my confession about essentially summoning the train on my kid, several dropped out of the group completely, and I couldn't blame them. Yeah, most agreed that we had all benefited from the lessons learned on that godforsaken rolling tomb, but that doesn't mean that most would ever wish such a thing on anyone else, let alone their own children. And while this did make me realize that I was absolutely right to feel so guilty for what I had done, it didn't change my mission. I had to find a way to bring my son home. Some time passed, with new members joining and others leaving. Some agreed with what I had done, claiming that they had made similar wishes due to their own ill-behaved children. Some essentially called me pure evil, worse than the forces behind that wretched train. Those were the ones I tended more to side with, truth be told. It was in late August, when a suggestion from one of our members, who had been around for a while but rarely spoken up, finally set me on the right course to track down my quarry. The username was simply Joe, leaving me no idea if it was a man or a woman. They hadn't shared much about their own experience, but had said enough to know that they were in the right place. The suggestion they made, though, was so bloody simple, I almost felt like an idiot for not thinking about it sooner. Don't look for the train, but those bound to board it. From there, Joe, myself, and a few other members began scouring groups, forums, and anything else we could find, dedicated to parents exhausted by their ill-tempered children. It took time to track down the worst. Not just run-of-the-mill brats, but those likely to grow up to be the stuff of nightmares. But it became easier as time passed. I could only imagine what Joe had been through in life, given that they showed remarkable instincts when it came to this investigation, clearly no stranger to the true darkness of human nature. And by early November, we had a solid lead on a handful of parents whose kids were likely due for a most terrifying ride that Christmas. I won't get into the lengths we had to go to actually find who those people were outside of the internet, or where they lived for that matter, but by mid-December, we had narrowed down the worst of the worst, as Joe called him. A 10-year-old from a small town in Idaho who, if his behavior was not addressed soon, could very well grow up to be the next great American serial killer. Having heard about this kid's actions for the last few months, I almost thought his mother was exaggerating. But after a bit of research, it wasn't hard to find that there were news reports to back up these claims. Those parents had somehow managed to keep him out of juvenile hall. It would seem that he was indeed quite the monster in the making. From the gymnasium of his junior high school burning down, with no evidence of the arsonist left behind, to a series of brutal murders of neighborhood pets. If anyone deserved a trip on that train, it was this kid. By the time that Christmas Eve came around, I sat in my car only a few houses down from where we had tracked the one likely to be beckoned by Abigor to board the Bipolar Express. And if I had any say in the matter, he would not be boarding alone. Yes, from what I could tell from my own experience, as well as those with whom I had conversed for many months, I wasn't certain if anyone but the chosen target could even perceive the train, but I could only hope that, given the fact that I was a previous passenger, that I still had the ability to see it. I had almost dozed off a time or two when the ground began to rumble ever so slightly. I almost jumped out of my seat, expecting to see that engine barreling toward me, but there was nothing, only a vacant, silent, snow-lined street. The rumbling dwindled a bit, but remained constant, yet there wasn't a trace of what I had driven all these miles to see. I glanced at my phone to see that it was just a few minutes before midnight, certain that this is exactly when it should arrive, but it didn't. Minutes trickled by as I glared through my frosted windshield, my fingers trembling from the combination of cold and hope drifting from me. That was until I saw the front door drifting open on the home of the very family I had tracked to this location, with a small, timidly afraid, and quite bundled up young boy peering out from within. He hesitantly stepped out into the snow, trudging toward the road, speaking what sounded to be only one side of a conversation. When he stopped in place about halfway down the path to his house, he began shaking his head erratically, spinning around and sprinting back toward the door, a door he would not reach. His feet kicked vigorously against the snowy path, screaming at the top of his lungs as he appeared to be dragged across it by an invisible force. My mind flashing back to elongated fingers encasing my entire torso, I knew that this was my cue to get moving. Stumbling as my feet battled against the slippery ground, my heart racing so hard I just knew that it would rupture any moment. But I had to make it. I had no clue what I would do once I reached the struggling kid, given that I couldn't even see what he was trying to fight off. This was my only chance. I knew that much. By the time I reached him, my side splitting from the flat-out sprint, almost buckling me to the ground. My breath caught in my throat, with the sight of him levitating from the snow, gradually drifting higher. Bellowing a frantic scream as I wrapped my fingers around his shoulder in an attempt to drag him back to the ground, I felt all life leaving me when I found myself gazing into those empty, spherical eyes I still saw in my nightmares. "And what are you doing here, little man?" the conductor asked, his smile peeling wider across his poreless face. As I fell to the ground, unable to battle against the massive hand wrapped around the boy as he was practically tossed into the open door, I witnessed that familiar, steaming behemoth manifesting before my eyes. It was as though reality itself peeled apart, unwrapping the train rumbling on the tracks, now separating one side of the street from the other. The volume of the thundering engine ramped up as though spun on the dial of a radio. Abigor did not wince. His posture didn't falter as the boy pounded on the now closed door behind his back, desperate to break free. The conductor only slipped his now proportionate hands behind his back, bending at the waist to look down on where I lay sprawled out on the snow, just as he had decades prior. "Let me on," I demanded, stumbling back to my feet to gaze directly into his ominous, haunting stare. "One ride per customer, I'm afraid." Again, the smile did not drift from his face, his composure remaining condescending, regardless of the fact he now stood the same height, give or take. "You took my son,"
At your request. It took everything I had not to strike him, my own guilt blending with rage. Give him back. He drifted his head from one side to the other, his eyes not breaking from mine. That is not how things work. You let me leave. You let me go home. Let him. You passed your trial, he said softly, interrupting my barely coherent scream. He did not. Please, I begged, unable to fend off the tears leaking down my face. Give us another chance. He studied me for a moment before tilting his head down, breaking his gaze from mine. Swiftly turning his head back to the train as though responding to something I couldn't hear, I noticed his jaw clenching. Whipping his head back to face me, his eyes darkening as they had many years before, he let out a sigh, his smile momentarily faltering. Very well, he said, stepping to the side as the door creaked open. You may proceed. As I glanced at him and back to the open door, choosing not to ponder on the fact that the kid who had just entered was nowhere to be seen, I just began to step forward. Raising my foot to the first step, I felt a hand tightly grip onto my shoulder, turning to face the one who grinned back at me. If you succeed, perhaps you shall both be free. Again, that smile widened all the more. Should you fail, well. Naturally, he gave me no answer, only continued smiling. As I proceeded up the steps, I found it strange that each felt further away than the last. It was like the distance between one step to the other almost doubled. It wasn't until I walked in, that musty scent almost toppling me back to the floor as the bitter nostalgia attacked me, when I understood what was happening. When I glanced over and then upward to meet the gaze of the conductor as he strolled in behind me, I almost began to hyperventilate, glancing down to the small, almost stumpy hand patting my now considerably smaller body. I couldn't even wrap my mind around it. No adults, Abigor said, gesturing to the car ahead with a tilt of his head. Not here. A stuttered sigh drifted from the mouth of a child, which took the place of the body I had worn before entering this madhouse. But I followed behind my guide once more, as he led me into the all-too-familiar carriage. Though the inherent fear of being back here again was making it hard to focus on anything else, it gradually became more clear how similar everything looked. I could almost swear that even the sporadic tinsel hanging from the chandeliers was in exactly the same pattern as before. Whether it was seeing through the eyes of a child again, ramping up the terror of everything I'd experienced the last time I stood in this room, or just the nature of being upon such an otherworldly vessel, it genuinely felt like it was not only my body which had regressed, but I had indeed traveled back through time to my first visit on this train. As I absent-mindedly took a seat, trembling from head to toe as the conductor gingerly strolled to the front of the cab and out the door, I knew that it wasn't simple nostalgia that drove the chill which caressed my spine. Looking across my surroundings at the fellow passengers forced to share each other's company, I almost felt my jaw drop at the sight. 2 gingers sat up front, a girl and a boy, just a little taller. A blonde kid turning his head slightly to reveal the round-rimmed glasses as he pushed them higher up his nose. Across from me sat the boy who had inadvertently helped in revealing the train to my grown eyes, both trembling and sweating at the same time, a sight which once more caused my mind to flash back to the night my outlook shifted. Ugh, why is it so damn hot in here? He said loudly enough to catch the attention of everyone in the cab. As I watched the kid with the glasses turn his head, shushing the new arrival, I felt the strangest sort of lurching in my stomach. Was all of this, each of these kids, the blistering heat, the scenario itself, was it all just a performance? Hey, you shush it, you four-eyed prick, the kid belted, unbuttoning his coat. Don't, I blurted before I had the chance to even think about what I was doing. Go to hell. the kid replied, not even looking up at me. "Keep your coat on, kid. He'll punish you if you try to eat my asshole," he said, finally looking up to face me. "Who the hell do you think you are anyway, calling me a kid, huh?" He just continued to pull off his coat, glaring at me the whole time, just to spite me. When I heard the door sliding open with footsteps approaching where the boy and I still stared at one another, I knew that there was nothing I could do. "I'm sorry, kid. I tried." "Here, we only have one rule," the conductor interrupted, inspiring my guts to churn. "Never, ever let them—" "Fuck off, you damn creeper," the bratty kid snapped, pulling his coat the rest of the way from his upper half. "You ain't about to—"
"Cool," Abigor droned, snapping his fingers. Though his back was facing me at this point, I swear I could feel that satisfied grin reaching across his face, as that same faceless creature rolled up with the cart, holding that same single mug and that same steaming pitcher. I just turned away from the scene about to play out before me, cupping my hands around my ears. Yes, I knew that I could attempt to intervene or distract that damned conductor, but I also knew that this would be of little use. Sure, this particular kid was possibly a bigger and brattier asshole than many of the more prickly adults I'd known, let alone their children. But he didn't deserve this, just as I hadn't. As the muffled screams, gargles, and whines echoed through in between the fingers pressed to the side of my head, I felt such a piercing stab of guilt, not only at the fact that I couldn't help this little turd, but the knowledge that I had wished this upon my own son, that I asked for this to happen to him as well. Sometime after the boy's flesh reformed from where that acid-like concoction had spilled out from within him, I watched another familiar scene play out before my eyes. One by one, I watched on while Abigor punched the tickets of the room's occupants. I could swear that everything proceeded exactly as it had before, down to the pleas and whines of the red-haired siblings and the tears of the blonde kid. The new arrival put up much more of a fight than I had, and, as I suspected when I sat in his seat, that was a bad idea. By the time the conductor quite literally picked the kid up by the throat, slamming his little body hard onto the floor of the aisle, the little guy had no strength left to fend off the incoming hole puncher. But my conviction to not intervene and allow things to run their course was wearing thin. I knew that this was my trial. This son of a bitch had my son stowed away somewhere, wherever those who don't pass these sadistic trials may end up. And I feared that if I made a single move to prevent him from doing as he wished, I would never see my son again. Not only that, but I would be damned to the same fate, whatever that may be. When the conductor lifted the wailing boy back from the floor, tossing him upon his seat, I finally allowed my own leaking eyes to meet those of the violently trembling child. The expression on his face did not exclusively reflect the pain of this most recent assault, but the betrayal of the rest of us in this godforsaken train car who just sat there and allowed it to happen. Somewhere inside my fracturing mind, I was attempting to convince myself that it was all right, that my experiences and injuries upon this haunting vessel had made me a better person. But witnessing these things from the outside looking in, that was a far less simple pill to swallow. That even at my worst, I deserved this brutality.
What about him?"
the whimpering boy asked as Abigor turned to leave the cab.
"Him?"
the conductor replied, exaggerated confusion in his voice.
"That kid!"
the boy yelped, holding out the pointer finger of his bleeding hand. The conductor turned to face me, an oddly amused expression on his face as he raised an eyebrow, his smile more mischievous than I had seen it before. With that, I witnessed another familiar sight from a far removed angle than I had seen it the last time, that of the Slender Man turning on his heels and dashing through the door up front.
"Why?"
the kid across from me asked, his voice now shaky and timid.
Why didn't you have to? I just held my hand up after taking a moment to inspect my palm to ensure the scar I had worn for decades was still a part of my regressed form. It's all healed up, he said, more than asked. You've been here before? I just nodded, letting out a trembling sigh. Yeah, a long time ago. But you're just a kid. How? He slid closer to me, ignoring the exaggerated shushing from the others. He squinted his eyes a bit, seemingly studying my face, after I followed his example, shuffling to the edge of the seat next to the aisle. You're the guy. The one who tried to stop me. I just nodded, choosing not to reveal the fact that I wasn't there to stop him from boarding. And not really. Though I battled my subconscious as it attempted to unveil the truth of my own actions, I hadn't even taken the time to care if he got on the train or not. He was just a means to an end. Just my way back. I should have listened, he said, his voice cracking, dropping his head to hide the fresh tears forming in his eyes. I should have ran as fast as I could. It wouldn't have worked, I replied, my childlike voice still catching me off guard. I tried to run too. He just glanced back up at me, his expression clearly puzzled. Then why'd you get back on? I opened my mouth to reply, but found my words locked in my throat. You got away before, right? I nodded, averting my gaze from his, the guilt of allowing this boy to board blending with the existing shame I had felt since my son went missing. So, why'd you come back? It took my son, was all I could convince my lips to utter. I could feel the piercing gaze of the kid upon my now reddening face. I knew that he could easily suss out the truth of things, that his fate hadn't even entered into the equation. He was just my way back, nothing more. I get it, he said, his previously gentle voice far more bitter and cold. It's messed up, but I get it. I know my own folks would throw me in the trash for a better offer too. It's not like that, I belted, knowing full well that it was at least somewhat that. If I can find my son, I can get us all out of here, but you gotta... My bartering for forgiveness, or whatever the hell I was attempting, was cut short by the door sliding open again. The boy and I both turned to face those wide, unblinking eyes as they appeared to separate, one drifting left and the other right, as though each were focusing on one of us. Given that everything up until this point had followed the same script I had experienced, I couldn't help but assume that I was playing the part of Sophie this time around. Sure, there was nothing inspiring and special about me, nothing with which to motivate this kid to put his life on the line for me. But Abigor said that I had a trial to either fail or succeed. I had to believe that this was my role here. Just as the cute little pigtailed girl had done, I jumped into the aisle as the demon dressed as a train conductor came charging toward us. I balled my little hands into fists, bracing for the impact of being swept from the floor. Whether this was a variance in the script or something improvised around my unexpected arrival on the scene, though, things did not go quite as I remembered them. Abigor just stopped in place, glaring down at me, his wide smile having shrunken to an off-kilter, upturned sliver across his face. I could feel the eyes of the boy I had essentially followed on board as they cut from me to the conductor and back again. Where, oh where can your little boy have gone? He said, his tone mocking in its light-hearted whimsy. I couldn't even fathom what to reply to this, whether he was simply baiting me into blowing this slim opportunity to save my son, or just delighted in attempting to make a fool out of me. But I grew steadily more suspicious that none of this was about the redemption of the boy to my right. Not this rerun of a performance, nor whatever part I was meant to play. What do you want from me? I asked, my teeth gritting so hard that my jaw ached. Once more his grin stretched all the more, while the scowl sank across his enlarged eyes. Excuse me, young man, he said, not breaking his gaze from mine as he reached over, wrapping his fingers around the head of the boy across from me. But this stowaway has interfered enough. We should leave his presence." With that, he plucked the kid from his seat and began almost lazily strolling to the back of the carriage, dragging the writhing and wailing boy by the head. I spun to see his little legs beating against the faded carpet while my mind attempted to wrap around what was happening here. Was my involvement actually making things worse for this kid? With no trace of the lone, kind spirit who accompanied me on my maiden voyage, I assumed myself to be playing her part in all of this. But what if I was only aggravating an already sensitive wound? I turned to see that none of the other occupants of this room were even reacting to what was going on. In many ways, of course, given that I now saw them to be part of this illusion, performance, I imagined they had no need to play the part for one who could see them for what they really were. "What do I do?" I whispered to myself before shouting the words out to my fellow passengers. "What do I do?" Again, they didn't react, not even a little. Part of me wanted to chase after the conductor and his prisoner, terrified of what would happen to the kid if I did nothing. But what if interfering more than I already did would only make things worse? Not only that, but if I were to prevent Abigor from completing whatever game he was playing this time, would that cause me to fail my own trial? If I tried to help this kid, would I forfeit my opportunity to ever again see my son? My mind battling between all of the varying angles it could conjure, I was growing all the more desperate to figure out what to do next. "What should I do?" I whined again, begging those whose company I shared to hear me, or to grant me some sort of answer. My panic transforming to rage, I stomped toward the blonde kid, the closest to where I stood. The second I was close enough, I reached out, wrapping my fingers around his shoulder, screaming, "Say something!" I both attempted to spin him to face me, while rounding his seat to face him, letting out a single startled yelp when I caught sight of the head which lazily rolled to the side. Though I knew that I had seen his face since boarding, and when he attempted to shush the conversation I was trying to have with the kid, my already frenzied brain could not even begin to rationalize what I looked upon now. The round-rimmed glasses still sat upon a completely featureless face, though not completely dissimilar from the one who had rolled up with the steaming mug of bubbling acid. This fleshy husk seemed free of any sort of sentience, now that it did not share the company of the guest of honor. It was like a rag doll of a mannequin, its hollow body wrapped with pale, freckled flesh. I almost stumbled to the floor as I stepped back from this haunting thing, bumping into the seat across the aisle. After gathering my bearings, I reluctantly inspected the gingers up front to see the same lifeless dolls not looking back at me. My mind still reeling, understanding that my options had now crumbled to either sitting in this godforsaken train car, sharing the company of no longer sentient fabrications, or once more braving the elements as I traversed the roof of the train. I still didn't know if I was supposed to intervene in the lesson being taught to the seemingly only other human upon this wretched vehicle, or just to follow where the conductor may lead. But I could clearly see that no answers would be provided here. Like I had done so many years prior, I climbed the ladder just outside the back door to the carriage. While I had briefly considered heading forward through the inside, I was neither certain of what may lay behind the door, nor if I could even reach those who already had a solid lead on me from inside. This time, though, I was far less hesitant as I plundered onward, just sprinting across the cars as quickly as I could, between the snow and the bitter wind threatening to topple me off the side. When I saw the distant flickering flame ahead, I readied myself to just slide right between the creature's legs, wasting no more time or energy on any sort of battle. Naturally, as this both alarmingly predictable and hauntingly unpredictable journey had been, the closer I got to that flame, the more I could see that things were not as they had been the last time. It wasn't only the fact that the light was much closer to the surface of the roof either, but the hopeless sobs barely audible over the howling wind. Lessening my stride as I approached, the volume of the crying child having ramped up as high as the surrounding soundtrack, I could make out the silhouette of the one perched upon the snowy roof. By the time I stood before the small boy I had followed onto this highway to hell, where he sat alone and clearly broken, I felt my own eyes beginning to rebel against the bitter sight. He just left me here, the boy said, his eyes red and puffy, his body slumping while shivering. Where did he go? I asked, sitting down across from him with the lone lantern between us. He just shrugged, gesturing behind him with a tilt of the head. Why are you guys doing this to me? What? No, I'm not. I know I'm a bad kid. His eyes cut from mine to the lantern, which shed its subtle light across his trembling frame. I know I deserve this, he mumbled, as if to himself more than to me. But I can do better. I felt my own lower lip quiver as he spoke, my mind flashing back to what a handful I had been for my parents. I thought about my son and how hopeless my wife and I would feel when he would unleash his temper. My heart broke for this child before me still, but all the more for the one I had failed and tossed to the wolves. I want to go home, the boy whined, his trickling tears unleashing, his body spasming from the weight of them. I've been where you are, kid. So long ago. His glassy eyes raced to meet mine while I fought the temptation to look away. With a combination of my own shame and guilt, I knew what he would think if I diverted my gaze, that I thought as little of him as he thought of himself right now. I was awful before I boarded this godforsaken hell on wheels. My eyes spilled down my face just as much as his. I was cruel, selfish, and arrogant. I felt like I deserved what they did to me here too. That's what I thought anyway. In this moment, as I gazed into the fracturing expression of a kindred spirit, something I should have taken the time to do with my own son rather than wishing him to be fixed by torment and torture, I began to accept what must be done. I got to my feet, staggering slightly as my equilibrium adjusted to being upright on a speeding surface. Reaching out my hand to the violently trembling boy before me, I helped him from his slumped position, keeping his hand in mine when we both stood facing one another. One way or another, I said, my voice quaking from the understanding of what I may have to surrender to make things right. I'm getting you home. I had no idea what it would take, whether I would have to fight the captain of this thundering prison as much as I was able to in this shrunken form, or if I would have to offer him the satisfaction of committing me to an eternity on this vessel of the damned. Whatever it took, though, I was not playing his games anymore. All I knew was that if I could neither save myself nor the one I was so desperate to free from this hell, perhaps I could still give this kid a chance at a new life. The only lead I had to go on at this point was that the conductor had continued onward after leaving his prisoner behind to either freeze or abandon all hope. Somewhere out in the darkness, I would find him. What I would do when I got there, of course, I had no fucking clue. Perhaps I would figure that out when I got there. You with me? I asked the kid, whose posture now mimicked the phony confidence of my own. He just nodded, smearing the tears from his eyes with the sleeve of the arm whose fingers were not clasped in mine. With that, I lifted the lantern from between us, moved side by side with my charge, and we began our journey. It took some convincing to urge the boy to leap to the next carriage, but not unlike my first voyage across these tracks, he grew more confident with each one we traversed. We would separate hands during these leaps of faith, with me allowing him to go first, just to be sure he cleared it safely. Once I reached his side again, we linked back up as we plundered onward. We came across no obstacles as we trudged on, no lantern-headed figures, and no unexpected jarring of the carriages beneath our feet. It was almost unsettling how effortless things became as we moved from one car to the next, but I could swear that there were far more of them than I had crossed the first time I was here. I couldn't help but wonder if each boxcar held another child facing their own specific trials. It occurred to me that maybe even my own son was in one of them, still desperately attempting to free himself after years of this. But I knew I couldn't allow myself to get lost in these theories if I ever hoped to complete my appointed task. Perhaps if I could set this boy free, even if I ended up locked away myself, I could still track down my son and find a way to break us out too. But I had to focus on one thing at a time. One mission, one trial, one soul I could free from this damnation. After traveling for what felt like hours to such small and weakening legs, we finally took a moment to stop and rest our weary bones as we looked down at the trailer of coal before us. Just as it had been the last time, the engine lay just behind this mound of darkened rock, but I found myself strangely unafraid, but quite exhausted. We sat for a moment, our legs dangling over the ledge, our eyes glaring on what I hoped to be our final obstacle before whatever climax lay ahead. When I noticed the silhouette rising from the front of the coal car, though, that absent fear returned, tripling what I felt as we began this potentially ill-fated trek. The snow was still coming down hard, with the train still speeding onward. Our surroundings beyond this vessel were either blanketed by the constant snowfall, or simply did not exist. Just a void with a solitary train gliding through it. Whatever the case, of course, as the slender figure began to take wide strides across the mounds of coal toward us, there was no mistaking those lanky proportions and far too confident movements. I could swear I saw that sinister smile splitting the shadowed head in two, widening more than I had ever witnessed before. Even when Abigor struck me down with his blade, I don't think his grin appeared this satisfied and malicious. By the time the boy and I had risen back to our feet, only the space between the carriages separated us and the lord of this vessel. He just stood there, his hands behind his back, his body not so much as shifting from the wind to his back or the speeding train beneath us. The kid and I stood side by side, but I adjusted my posture a bit, moving myself between the boy and the conductor. "Let him go," I called out, my voice barely resonating against the constant wind and snow. "No," our captor replied, his almost glowing teeth barely separating to allow the word to pass through. "Take me. Let him go and keep me." "I already have you. I have you both. Why would I set either free?" "I'm here on my terms, not—" "No, boy. I allowed you to board on my terms. And you failed only moments before boarding. This child has proven nothing to me, nothing of which would demonstrate he is anything but a monster." "What the hell do you know about that?" Okay, yeah, that was not the most rational argument, but I was running on empty at this point. Yes, I knew that I was unlikely to succeed in my own trial, but I had already failed? He didn't even give me a chance, and he wasn't giving this kid a chance either. "I know monsters, child. Why do you think I was charged with this? I saw you for what you are, and I allowed you to leave. And what did you do? You damned your own son. You did that. I should never have listened to Zophiel. You belong here." "No," I said, balling my hands into fists. "You belong here. Not me. Not us." I leapt forward right at him, toppling us both to the hard coal without a second thought. While I didn't fully realize why at first, this jump had been more effortless than those that came before, even with this ground being uneven and lumpy. As I got back to my feet, stepping toward the man who was lifting himself up from the coal, once more unleashing the sword that struck me down upon our first meeting, I finally understood why these steps were more confident. Whether before my leap, during, or after, I couldn't know. But as my strides grew wider, I allowed a smirk to cross my once more adult face. I'm not a child anymore, Abigor, I said, not breaking my gaze from the darkened, rage-fueled eyes before me. I am here on my terms, no matter what you have to say about it. He looked so small now that my gaze was on the same level as his. So thin, so weak, so pathetic. Yes, I had made mistakes, both in my childhood and as an adult. That was my cross to bear. Maybe I could neither save myself nor my son, but this kid still has a chance, I said to myself as I cut my glance back to the boy shivering on the boxcar I had left behind. As did yours. His grin stretched all the more while he still found a way to look down his nose at me, even from standing on the same level. Yeah, he was right, of course. My son did have a chance I threw away, hoping to fix him in the same way my outlook was adjusted. But did I really take the time to try? Yes, my wife and I attempted to discipline him, to get through to him, to calm the beast within. But how much effort did I really put in? Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I knew I took the easy way of seeing things more clearly. I was an awful kid for a long time, and all it took was a little torture, torment, and agonizing pain to see things more clearly. And I wished that upon my own child. Jesus Christ. I felt my body slump, my conviction faltering. I lowered my head, feeling my body shrink down in its proportions once more. Abigor was right. I was a shitty father, just as I was a shitty kid. Maybe I did belong here after all. As the cackling laughter echoed from the one who approached me, that wasn't the only sound I heard above the howling wind. Don't give up now! I whipped my body around to see the boy standing upon the carriage behind me, his hands cupped around his mouth and tears streaming from his eyes. Farewell, little boy. The voice sneered from the darkness, my eyes still locked with the one desperate to break free from this madness. Once more I heard the whoosh of the blade slicing through the air down upon me, while I gave the kid a quick wink, spinning to face my executioner again. Whether it was the desperate faith of the one counting on me, my own understanding that my own survival was only a vague factor in this, or simply the fact that I could not tolerate the idea of allowing the smug herald of this miserable train to win, I finally felt more driven than ever before. In one swift movement, faster than I even believed my body to be capable, I practically launched myself from the coal, wrapping my tiny fingers around the wrists of the one swatting the air above me. As my feet touched back down, I only vaguely registered the fact that I once more stood on the same level as my attacker, his strength faltering against my own as I prevented his blade from moving any further. Not this time, I began to smugly say, before the coal beneath my feet began to tremor so violently I just knew that I would be launched from this very spot any second. The conductor and I both fell back to the uncertain floor, while a startled scream bellowed from behind me. Well, Abigor said, his smile gone and his eyes wider than I had seen them yet. This isn't good. The entire train began to shift and quake, violently rocking from one side to the other. I heard the sound of cracking and splitting, inspiring me to glance over the side of the carriage, my jaw falling loose at the sight before me. Though the surface we were speeding across was unlike anything I had seen before, like an endless sheet of glossy black stone within this otherwise darkened void, the snow seeming to pass right through it, not landing. The quickly spider-webbing cracks that split across it revealed a haunting, flickering orange light beneath. It looks like none of us will be going home after all, Abigor said, dropping his sword and falling defeatedly to his knees. The crumbling ground echoed from all around us as I made a near hopeless run toward the screaming child, clutching onto the roof of the boxcar. It felt more like poorly choreographed dancing as I bounced from one unsteady pile of coal to the next, making yet another leap of faith when I reached the back. The second I landed, almost sliding back from the slippery surface, I practically threw myself onto the boy when the train began to fishtail. pinning the kid beneath me to the best of my ability, my hands grasping onto each side of the carriage. I took a reluctant glance to the rear of the train. I could almost feel my heartbeat stop cold at the vision of the numerous boxcars as they spun like the tail of a dragon. They waved this way and that before seemingly making to circle themselves, making me envision the Ouroboros making ready to devour its own tail. I took a hesitant glance behind me to see no trace of the one I had followed here, only the coal and the sword he had discarded upon it. "We gotta move, kid," I said with absolutely no confidence in these words. "You with me?" "Move where?" he whimpered, something I had no answer to. "Anywhere but here," was all I could muster as I pushed myself up to completely unbalanced legs. Once I was as steady as I could hope to be, I picked up the boy, throwing him over my shoulder. "Cover your face, kiddo," I said, taking the first hesitant step. Though the train was shuddering in its entirety, the ground beneath it splitting and tearing itself apart more and more, I still managed to find my footing. It wasn't easy, but it was still far swifter progress than my tinier legs had been able to achieve. Yeah, I had no idea where we were going, nor what I may be looking for, but there had to be a way off of this vessel of the damned. When we reached the end of one carriage, I leapt to the next, making sure I could release the boy if I had to, should my feet betray me on the other side. A few boxcars later, with those ahead still attempting to spiral to meet the engine, the trembling from behind grew far more chaotic, with an ungodly loud snapping sound, followed by a crunch. I did not want to look behind, afraid that I knew exactly what I would see, but I had to know what was coming for us next. Again, my jaw almost dropped to the floor at the sight of the engine, the trailer of coal, and the two boxcars we had left in our wake tumbling through the blackened sheet of nothingness. There was an eerie howl from where they descended to the depths of whatever hell lay beneath this void between worlds, assuring me that death itself would be favorable to following in their wake. As the front of the train fell, the rear appeared to somewhat straighten back out as it quaked against the shuddering surface beneath. That was all I needed to turn my reluctant run into a mad sprint for our lives. "Don't look back," I called out as I felt the boy attempting to raise his head from where he was slumped over my shoulder. With a whimpering gasp he let out. I'm fairly certain he didn't listen to me on that. And when his grip around me tightened all the more, I knew that we were of a similar mindset. Boxcar after boxcar, my sprint would not let up. Even with the echoing chaos behind us, the ground violently shifting from side to side beneath my feet, and the uncertainty of what may lie ahead or behind, I would not let up. Within moments, we had spanned almost the entirety of what remained of the train. With only 2 cars left to go, I was beginning to lose any hope of survival, if there had ever been any to begin with. I think I had clung on to the hope that there would be some miraculous revelation ahead, maybe some mystical portal to escape from this madness. Yeah, like a emergency exit or something, as ridiculous as that even feels to say out loud. But when we reached the end of the carriage, the final carriage, with only the bleak nothingness of a seemingly endless void behind us, I knew that this attempt to escape had been for nothing. I looked back over my shoulder to see each boxcar I had left behind falling into the depths below, one by one. "I'm sorry, kid," I said, falling to my knees. "I thought I could, but you tried," he said, slipping from my shoulder, standing before me. "Maybe that's all we can really do in the end." As my vision regulated, having been somewhat blurred from the bitter wind and my flat-out sprint, I finally took the time to see the kid clearly. My heart dropped as my eyes traced across the face I had adored since he took his first breath, my hand wrapping around his as he lay it on my face. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," I said, my voice cracking from the realization combined with the guilt of damning my own son to this madness. "I should never have." "Down here!" A strikingly familiar voice called out, interrupting my words and the flow of hopeless tears. Shuffling to the end of the carriage, I could barely believe my eyes when I saw the face of my tormentor, wearing a far kinder expression than I thought his face to be capable of. He just stood there, looking up from the landing below, his sword somehow having returned to his hand. With one quick flick of his wrist, his blade sliced through reality itself, just beyond where the train came to an end. Even with this vessel still hurtling towards its own damnation, that vibrating, shimmering tear in reality remained, as though attached to the very fabric of this speeding vehicle. "Through here!" Abigor called out, casting his weapon aside and holding his hands up to us. I just glared at him, desperate to know whether or not this was a trick, like some final cruel lesson he wished to teach. "Trust me," he pleaded, his spherical eyes almost manic in their own desperation. There was something in his expression so vastly different from the one which has visited me in so many nightmares, something unabashedly warm and genuine. With a nod, I lowered my son down to him, giving Caleb a nod and a smile to assure him that this was all right. The conductor took him in his arms, raising a hand up to me, but as the final boxcar left on this plane of existence began to careen down into the abyss, my body slipped from its upright pose. I just gripped onto the ledge with everything I had. "Take him home," I said, giving an accepting nod and a smile to both who now looked up at me with sadness in their gaze. I lingered long enough to witness the conductor carrying the boy who now screamed for his father through the shimmering rip. As the tear began to seal back up in their wake, I saw Abigor glance back through one final time, tipping his finger to the tip of his cap, giving me a quick wink before the void sealed back shut. Releasing one final sigh, accepting that I had achieved what I had hoped to, that my son would return to the world I had inadvertently cast him from, I released my grip. This was all right. It was okay. I may not survive this trip after all, but that didn't matter. Not really. As I felt my body sliding down the slippery surface, closing my eyes in hopes that I may not survive the fall itself and not have to exist in wherever this vessel was headed, I felt my tumble come to a swift and sudden stop. I glanced up at my outstretched arm before me, to the fingers clutching its wrist. "You didn't think I was going to leave you hanging?" Those beautiful, big brown eyes looked down into mine, a playful smirk crossing her lips. "Sophie?" As she pulled me back to my feet, planting to the ground, I could not see. There was no trace of either the Bipolar Express, nor the void through which it crashed. There I stood, face to face with the little girl with whom I had journeyed the last time, my body once more having reverted to its childlike form. Our surroundings were nothing but a subtly glowing fog, but it felt both tangible and serene. "Who are you?" I asked, choosing this question over "how the hell did you just pull me off a careening train from hell?" "Who are you, really?" I have many names," she said, taking my hand in hers as we began to walk together. "Sophie, Zophael, Jophael, though I prefer Joe." "Joe? Like Joe? Joe?" I stopped in place, the realization that she had been the one to set me on this path, almost knocking the wind out of me. She just gave me a smile, gesturing with a tilt of the head for me to get back on the path, wherever this path actually was. "Sometimes we all need someone to help us along the way, whether in understanding that the world doesn't revolve around us," she gave me a nudge and a smirk, "or in relocating something they lost, or abandoned in some cases. Abigor said he listened to you before, that you wanted to let me go." She just smiled again, not looking back at me. "So the two of you work together?" "Yeah, we may not have similar motivations, and I do not agree with some of his methods. But She just shrugged in a way that would suggest that these things are likely way above my understanding. And that's what I took from it anyway. Is the train really gone? I asked when we finally stopped walking. Our surroundings appeared no different. She just stepped before me, looking me in the eyes, that warm smile so gentle and kind. Don't believe everything you see. So... She placed her finger to my lips, subtly shaking her head. I just let out a chuckle, shaking my head a little bit, understanding that so many questions I have may never get answered. This, she said, glancing around and back to me, is where we say goodbye. What happens now? She just widened her smile, crinkling her nose, before she outstretched her hand and bounced her finger off my nose with a boop. Are you guys ever gonna wake up? The screeching, impatient voice inspired my eyes to dart open before meeting a far more annoyed expression than the last time I had looked upon my son. Before I knew it, I jumped from the bed, with Cindy still slowly moaning herself back to the waking world. I wrapped my arms around my kid, tears streaming from my eyes as he wrestled against my hug. Dad, he said, seemingly muffling a somewhat aggravated laugh. I know it's Christmas and all, but... His voice trailed off while I felt his hand slowly drift around my back. After a moment, he backed up, held his hands out before him, glancing down at his palm. His almost shocked eyes cut from his hand to my face, before he held out his palm to face me. I just let out a single chuckle, holding up my hand too, revealing that we both shared that same circular scar in the dead center. Over the following months, I could see Caleb fighting against his own attitude. Every now and then, when he would begin to rage about one thing or another, he would glance back down at his hand, steadily calming back down afterwards. At his request, we got him back in counseling, while my wife and I started attending therapy also. It would be a team effort to narrow down this parent-son dynamic for the better, but we all had the same goal in mind: to simply get better at it. As it turned out, Caleb has a bit of ADHD, as do I, and that was often responsible for a lot of his tantrums, as it was for mine, for that matter. As parents, yes, my wife and I should have done better. We should have taken the time to figure out what was going on with him, and not just chalked him up to being a brat. It's been a bumpy ride, but that's nothing I'm not used to. Hey, all it took was damning my kid to an uncertain 3 years of hell, and a hopeless journey to track him down to figure that out. Yeah, I'll accept my Parent of the Year award now, thank you very much. Caleb and I have spoken about his experience, though, as I have shared mine with him. From his perspective, as it turns out, he didn't set foot on that train until that night. Given how easily they could turn back the clock, it's not a stretch of the imagination that they can spin it forward a bit too, I suppose. From here, though, no more wishes for an easy fix when things don't go my way. It seemed I still had a lot of growing up to do myself, something I didn't learn enough about by having such a easy path to finding a better way to be, I suppose. You might want to take a note of that, Sophiel and Abigor, if you're listening. Maybe you guys can adjust your curriculum a bit for any future guests you may take on a ride. Yeah, maybe an exit survey or something would help. All in all, though, I do remain thankful for both opportunities I've had to ride the Bipolar Express, all things considered. Yeah, not exactly a Hallmark-style Christmas miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. I just hope to God that this is the last time I have any reason to board that damned train.